The worst album without debate is Yellow Submarine. I don't think many people will argue with this one. There's only 6 songs with vocals, and 2 of them are from other albums. The 4 that we're left with are also pretty hit or miss. The highlight of the record by far is Hey Bulldog, with John's aggressive and potent piano riffs and gritty guitar lines, as well as a killer bass performance from Paul. John's lead vocals, as well as all the other voices, had a real sense of playfulness and whimsy, but a lot of the lyrics are also pretty intriguing. I actually see Hey Bulldog as almost the beginning of the end for the Beatles. Not in terms of quality, but in terms of the friendships and collaborative spirit. I believe this was the last song recorded before the infamous trip to India, and ever since then it seemed pretty rare that the band would get along as well as they previously did, for a myriad of different reasons of course. All together now and only a northern song are pretty tongue-in-cheek and can definitely be enjoyed, but there just isn't much to them at all. Like 5 or 6 out of 10s for me. It's all too much, has such heavy feedback and so many rich swirling organ parts that were quite innovative for the time. It's quite psychedelic and experimental, with an almost celebratory tone, but it just doesn't hold together as a complete song as well as I'd like. Like, don't get me wrong, I like the track, but it's just a bit disjointed for me personally. The second half of the record are dainty, albeit still decent soundtrack pieces for the movie composed by George Martin. While Martin's contributions to the Beatles' sound cannot be overstated, this orchestral suite, though beautifully crafted, feels like filler material in the context of a Beatles album. It's cinematic, sure, but it doesn't carry the Beatles' signature touch. Except in spirit, I guess. If it's any consolation, the movie's really good, so that's something.
This happened once.
Beatles For Sale is often noted for its underlying tone of weariness, a stark contrast to the exuberance of A Hard Day's Night. The Beatles were, by this point, exhausted. Their grueling schedule of touring, media commitments, and relentless pressure to produce new hits is palpable in the somber lyrics of songs like I'm a Loser and No Reply. These tracks reflect a more introspective and vulnerable side of the band, marking a significant shift in their lyrical themes from simple love songs to more complex and personal narratives, the former of which does so rather boringly, whereas the latter is definitely one of the band's better original rock and roll outings. No Reply is almost Bob Dylan-esque in its emotionally charged style of storytelling, detailing unrequited love, a very common topic for the music industry at the time, but in a playful and entertaining manner. The album also stands out for its usage of cover songs. The Beatles' choice of covers, including rock and roll classics like Rock and Roll Music and Mr. Moonlight, harks back to their early days as a bar band in Hamburg and Liverpool, serving as a nod to their musical roots. However, the covers also highlight the band under pressure, filling album space amidst a hectic schedule. Whilst these covers certainly do demonstrate their ability to reinterpret and energize existing songs, they lack the groundbreaking innovation of the Beatles' own compositions. Covers of the former were seen pretty much everywhere at the time, and even if Mr. Moonlight isn't the most interesting composition-wise, it's still a highlight seeing John really give it his all vocally.
Mr. Moonlight. Oh, stop.
These are still very solid tracks and great covers for sure. I think the most popular song from this album, In 8 Days a Week, is also pretty overrated and doesn't offer much in terms of instrumentation, lyrics, or vocals even. However, it is deceptively experimental with the fade-in vocal effect. This wasn't really seen in 50s and 60s pop music. It adds a novel sonic texture for sure. The melody, whilst nothing special, is definitely suitably catchy and upbeat, including a harmonic blend of major chords and a bridge that provides a slight modal shift. Babies in Black is actually underrated for me, showcasing the Beatles' foray into more complex song structures and harmonies. The song is written in waltz time, a departure from the typical rock and roll backbeat, reflecting an interest in older, more traditional forms of music. Aside from that, there admittedly isn't much to the song, other than some pretty passionate vocal delivery, but it's one that I don't see mentioned much, so I figured I'd just say it. One of McCartney's contributions to the album, I'll Follow the Sun, is an older song that McCartney had written years earlier. This track has a gentle, melancholic feel and features a catchy melodic hook. It's a short and sweet song that harkens back to the Beatles' skiffle days and showcases McCartney's knack for crafting beautiful melodies. Timeless melodies. What You're Doing features a distinctive drum pattern and a jangly 12-string guitar riff. It's a precursor to the more complex, studio-driven work in my opinion. Now, I'm saying a lot of good things about the records, and that's a testament to how great the group is, but the album definitely has some notable shortcomings that go beyond a wee reliance on cover songs. Like I said, at this point the four were grappling with immense pressures of fame and demand for new material, which is probably why those covers are there to begin with. But even amongst the original tracks, there's a sense of fatigue that permeates the album, which sometimes translates to a lack of polish and depth in the tracks. Whilst many of the tracks definitely sound nice, there's nothing really beyond that. And there's also just a lot of pretty dull outings as well, like Honey Don't. For the majority of the tracks, like 8 Days or I'll Follow the Sun, there's nothing too much wrong with them, but there isn't really anything great either.
I should have known better with a girl like you.
A Hard Day's Night is notable for being the first Beatles album comprised entirely of original compositions with no cover songs. This was somewhat uncommon at the time and showcased the songwriting prowess of Lennon and McCartney, who were becoming formidable composers in their own right. Like Yellow Submarine, it's also a soundtrack to a movie. This time, the band's cinematic debut of the same name, and I think that this one is pulled off far better in my opinion. Right off the bat, the G7 sus4 chord that opens the record is one of the most iconic sounds in history, and the 12-string guitar used to make it would influence the sound of the 60s significantly. The track itself is really dynamic and encapsulates the Beatlemania that was sweeping the world at the time. The combination of catchy melodies and tight harmonies make this a quintessential Beatles track. Its upbeat pop rock style and relatable lyrics about working class life resonate broadly and sound great. But my favorite from this record is the next one. If I Fell, as a ballad, represents a deeper level of lyrical and musical sophistication from the band. The vocal harmonies are some of the most complex we've seen so far.
From the very start that you...
And the introspective lyrics explore the vulnerabilities of new love, which is a real departure from the simpler love songs of their earlier albums. The hand-holding line being an obvious sign of progression. Can't Buy Me Love and I Should Have Known Better have real bluesy vibes and catchy chori. The lyrics are simple, but delivered with a sincere youthful energy. Despite all this, the record still largely adheres to the early 60s pop formula. The songs, although beautifully crafted, do not have the experimental edge or stylistic breadth that the Beatles would later achieve. The album's focus is primarily on pop rock and ballads, with little of the genre diversity that the Beatles would later embrace. This lack of variety throughout the whole of their early careers, to be honest, feels slightly monotonous. To be fair, I think a lot of these issues stem from it being a soundtrack, so the songs are a bit less risky and more commercial perhaps. A lot of the tracks, especially the weaker ones, like pretty much the whole of the second half, just kind of blend together. There isn't really anything special going on at all. I won't dwell for too much because a lot of these early albums have similar pros and cons, just a different proportion of each, if you know what I mean.
Just to love you, but I'm not.
There's a greater emphasis on R&B and Motown on With the Beatles. I think tracks like All My Loving are great at showcasing how well the band worked together, why the Beatles are what they are. It's an incredibly tightly crafted pop song that showcases McCartney's melodic bass play and Lennon's underrated rhythm guitar. When you slap some really convincing lovey-dovey lyrics on top, you can't really go wrong. I think the covers are also among the best the band has come out with Till There Was You being my personal favourite, but Mr. Postman is also really fun and energetic. Roll Over Beethoven is pretty derivative and forgettable though. I don't think it's cool even for the time. You Really Got a Hold on Me is a much better version of a widely covered song in my opinion. Devil in Her Heart is also brilliant. There's also some filler songs like Little Child and Not a Second Time, which are very easy skips. However, part of the reason I rank this album over A Hard Day's Night is because tracks like Not a Second Time display some really advanced musical structures. Even if it wasn't executed too well, I definitely appreciate the risk taken here. I also think it's less uniform and predictable than Hard Day's Night, with some pretty interesting diversity in themes and vibes. From the soulful All I've Gotta Do to the closer Money. To be frank, I think a lot of these early albums at the lower point of the list are slightly interchangeable. Like, this changes day by day a lot, and it's not really a result of any hard-cold music theory or whatever. Sometimes it's just vibes. And as of this recording, I would rather listen to With the Beatles than Hard Day's Night. Fucking shoot me, I don't know.
When I was younger, so much younger than today.
Help, without doubt, has the most lyrical depth and personal expression pre-Rubber Soul. The songwriting here is really mature and honestly beautiful. I think I agree with John in regards to the titular track, as the lyrics and melody are great, but the mix is quite commercial and happy, sort of masking how introspective and vulnerable the vocal delivery could have been. I definitely prefer the clips you can find of John just playing and singing this tune on his piano. In the context of the album, however, I don't mind this as much because we get a really vulnerable performance with Yesterday. So some could argue that having Help and Yesterday include the same vibe could have been rather monotonous and a bit less interesting. Speaking of which, the string quartet in Yesterday is really grand and whimsical, signifying a real evolution in recording techniques and influence from George Martin, who insisted upon it. Ticket to Ride is similarly experimental with how heavy and rhythmic it is. You Like Me Too Much, despite being one of the weaker tracks on this thing, uses an electric piano, which is also unconventional. Yesterday is obviously great, but it's been talked about to death. There's a reason it's the most covered song, and there's a reason why none of the covers are as good as the original. It's because Help is the first time that the band boasts about how irreplaceable they are, and how good John and Paul are at featuring sophisticated, melancholic lyrics about loss and regret, coupled with simple yet profound melodies. I've Just Seen a Face and You've Got to Hide Your Love Away are really fun country-inspired jaunts that pave the way for more eclectic styles and subsequent musical ventures. It's a really great transition into the Beatles' next era of music. I think it's fair to say that this is the last traditional 60s rock and roll album that the Beatles came out with. The transition, however, is still very much in process, as shown by the filler tracks like It's Only Love, which is rather throwaway and banal lyrically. Same goes for the extremely basic Tell Me What You See. Additionally, the closer is really confusingly a cover of Dizzy Miss Lizzy, which is certainly energetically performed, but slightly grating and extremely out of place on a record with Yesterday and Ticket to Ride. The gap in quality and originality is very clear. It's also just weird to have your epic closing track be a cover. You're Gonna Lose That Girl is, in my mind, what the majority of the Beatles' early tracks are. This song demonstrates the band's ability to create compelling vocal harmonies and pop hooks, but it doesn't particularly push any boundaries musically or lyrically. It's a solid example of their mid-60s sound, but doesn't contribute significantly to the album's innovation. This one's also less interchangeable than the others. I'd pretty much always have it ranked higher than the previously mentioned albums for the cohesion, experimentation, maturity, and significance. Its strange structure and remnants of transitioning, however, do prevent it from being as good as the next album, which might be a controversial choice.
Run right home. What are you doing?
It's murder, I can't do it.
Let It Be occupies a unique position in the Beatles' discography, released as their final album in 1970, though largely recorded before their penultimate album. As a project enveloped in complexity and often seen as a documentation of the Beatles' disintegration, Let It Be has both its iconic moments and its contentious aspects. I think it features some of the most memorable and endearing songs in the Beatles' catalogue. The title track is a poignant ballad by Paul McCartney, offering a message of hope and resilience that has resonated with generations of listeners. But in my opinion, it's nothing more than that. I think it's just a worse, albeit still enjoyable version of his previous ballads of a similar vein, and that John has a better song about his dead mother on the White Album. Originally intended to be a return to their roots with the Get Back project, the album showcases a raw, unpolished sound that was somewhat of a departure from the highly produced aesthetic of Sgt. Pepper's or Abbey Road. This authenticity brings a different kind of energy and intimacy to tracks like The Two of Us and I've Got a Feeling, which capture the band playing together live, flaws and all. Those two tracks are probably the best pieces on this record because of that. But confusingly, the sound goes from unfiltered in tracks like Two of Us to wildly overproduced in songs like The Long and Winding Road and even Across the Universe. Lyrically and instrumentally, I think these are some of the most incredible songs of all time, but like many others, I heavily prefer their stripped back naked counterparts, which obviously aren't what's being judged in this video. Hence the record's placement this far down. For those who don't know, the production of Let It Be was famously fraught, with Phil Spector being brought in to rework the tapes after the band was dissatisfied with the original sessions produced by Glyn John Spector's Wall of Sound. Production on tracks like The Long and Winding Road was particularly divisive, criticized by some band members, especially Paul McCartney, for being overly intrusive and not to the band's original vision, which I can certainly see. Despite the tensions within the band, Let It Be includes moments of individual brilliance. George Harrison's I Me Mine and For You Blue and John Lennon's rock-driven Dig a Pony showcase their unique talents and contributions to the band's sound, even at the end of their collaboration. However, I have to note the underlying sense of melancholy and fragmentation. The recent documentary shows a band in disarray, with visible tensions and conflicts between members. This atmosphere impacted the cohesion of the album, which at times feels like more of a collection of individual songs rather than a unified work, if you know what I mean. Nowhere is this clearer than the inconsistent quality. While the album contains some high points, it also includes tracks that are seen as less significant or filler compared to the rest of the Beatles' work. Songs like Maggie May and Dig It feel underdeveloped and inconsequential. Honestly, a lot of this partially may have also been a result of the Beach Boys kind of being on hiatus because of the breakdown Brian Wilson was having, thereby eliminating their overseas competitor. Some might see a track like One After 909 as a fitting and novel acknowledgement of their roots, sort of a throwback to the rock and roll that got them so popular to begin with. I, for one, see it as the band having run out of patience for each other and not wanting to spend any more time than necessary just getting this shit done. The song isn't even that good either, in my opinion. I honestly don't know how my relatively low ranking of this album will fare amongst the presumably big Beatles fans who are watching this, so if there's something in this video I'd like to hear your opinion on, it's definitely this choice.
Last night I said these words to my girl.
The Beatles' debut album, Please Please Me, kicks off with I Saw Her Standing There, a track that immediately announces the arrival of a band that knows exactly what it is and isn't afraid to show it. Unlike later albums where the Beatles were in a state of transition, exploring new sounds and thematic depths, Please Please Me has a laser-focused intent. It's pure, unadulterated rock and roll mixed with pop sensibilities. The album, recorded in a single marathon session, is a testament to the band's raw energy and undeniable charisma. Please Please Me doesn't meander through different styles or wade into the waters of an introspective experimentation that characterized Rubber Soul or Revolver. Instead, it delivers straightforward rock and pop tracks that are both vibrant and incredibly impactful. The title track, with its harmonica-driven sound and upbeat tempo, epitomizes the album's immediate appeal. The song's commercial success helped define the Beatles' early sound, marrying pop hooks with rock energy in a way that few had managed before. Twist and Shout is performed with such fervor and raw vocal power by John Lennon that it often overshadows the original. Recorded at the end of the long recording session, Lennon's strained, passionate vocals capture the essence of the album's direct and unfiltered musical joy. Love Me Do, one of the first songs that showcased the Lennon-McCartney songwriting powerhouse, features a catchy melody and simple lyrics, driven by a distinctive harmonica part. It's a prime example of how the Beatles could take a straightforward pop formula and inject it with a fresh, engaging twist. I'm rather unflinching in my probably most unpopular opinion that this is their best early album. Please Please Me lacks the transitional feel of albums like With the Beatles or even Help, where the Beatles were still finding their new voice amidst their established style, and it also lacks the clear strains and frustrations that came from Let It Be. Instead, Please Please Me knows exactly what it aims to be, an energetic, captivating introduction to a band ready to take over the world. Its tracks are executed impeccably, each one crafted to grab and hold the listener's attention from the get-go. These rankings aren't just how good the batch of songs is, but how cohesive and holistic the album is as a whole, and it's difficult to argue that any of the albums so far are better than Please Please Me in that regard. The album's clear sense of identity and purpose sets it apart from other early Beatles works. There's no hint of the band trying to find their footing or experiment with their core sound. They present themselves as a fully formed phenomenon, capable of delivering both original compositions and cover songs with equal quality. This assuredness and the album's cohesive sound make it a standout debut, not just in the Beatles' catalogue, but in the whole rock and roll genre as a whole. Obviously, the sacrifice here is that it's very simply constructed record and doesn't change anything industry-wise or experiment much, as all it really does is use the current contemporary sound, but really well. It's also not without its filler like Misery and A Taste of Honey, but every record so far has had these kind of uninspired tracks. Obviously, the way it's recorded means that these aren't any sophisticated studio techniques, but I honestly like that a lot. I definitely prefer it over how they overproduce certain songs in Let It Be. There's no cheating here. If the band isn't flawless, which they are because of the amount of times they've played live together by this point, then you'll know. The band is so tight and together that it's unbelievable. And probably the biggest reason for this is Ringo's consistent drumming. Ringo might just be the most skilled musician in the band at this point in terms of proficiency at his instrument. There's also a lot of cover songs, which is a bit lame, but not enough for me to put Help or Let It Be above it. Once again, this might be more of just a vibes thing. I just love the sound of this one for whatever reason.
It could be there and it couldn't.
Could be where?
There. Or it couldn't.
Rubber Soul, released in 1965, marks a significant turning point in the Beatles' career, showcasing their transition from pop stars to innovative musical artists. This album not only redefined what the Beatles could be, but also influenced the direction of contemporary music at large. I think this album blends folk rock and wild music influences into a sophisticated, cohesive whole that demonstrates the band's growing artistic maturity. It features some of the most complex songwriting and lyrical depth seen in the Beatles' catalogue up to this point. Songs like Norwegian Wood, This Bird Has Flown introduce the sitar, which adds an exotic texture that complements the song's introspective, somewhat melancholic lyrics. The storytelling approach, describing a failed romantic encounter, showcases Lennon's maturing lyrical style, blending personal experience with broader themes of loneliness and confusion. Then there's In My Life, which is probably my favorite Beatles song. It mixes personal reflection with a nostalgic melody, showcasing why John Lennon is revered as the genius songwriter that I believe he is. It's a flawless song, and all of you should go and listen to it right now, after this video, obviously. Subscribe. Introspective lyrics reflecting on past memories and relationships have never been done better in music than this song, and the melodic piano solo is the perfect Baroque touch that somehow elevates it even further. It's a song you appreciate more and more as time goes on, and it's tough to remember that the whole album isn't this good, so it's not higher in my ranking. Now that being said, the other tracks on here still vary from great to admittedly kind of a mess and being filler. It opens nicely with the funky Drive My Car, which obviously lacks some of the emotion seen throughout the rest of the songs. It still holds up as a vibrant and witty song about ambition and celebrity. This soulful Motown influence is also seen in You Won't See Me, although it's performed less enjoyably in my opinion because of how repetitive and monotonous it can get. It's still an okay track though, I just never seek it out. Nowhere Man is often noted for its philosophical lyrics, which are a real departure from the silly love songs they put out a few years back by now. The tight vocal harmonies are certainly impressive, but they kind of overshadow everything else on the tune. Like, there isn't really anything to gawk at here other than the vocals, which there are better vocals on this album in my opinion. I think lyrically, Think For Yourself and The Word lack the subtlety that comes with the better songs on this record, the former being quite dense and heavy-handed, albeit with a nicely packaged fuzz bass, and the latter just being far too simplistic and repetitive. The same can be said for What Goes On, Ringo's song. Weirdly enough, I don't have the same complaint about Wait, but I really should considering how fillery it is. I think I'm just so used to being so ready to hear its introduction after In My Life on the track list, which gets me in a right state. I'm Looking Through You is, in my opinion, inarguably one of the worst tracks on the Beatles' catalogue because of just how much of a mess it is. It's pretty stunning that a song this badly produced was put out, especially by a band that has some of the best production of all time. But I guess time constraints can really just do that sometimes. Everything else about the track also just screams filler. Michelle, however, totally eclipses all of those songs because it's without doubt a real highlight in Paul's career thus far. A beautifully composed ballad that won a Grammy for Song of the Year. Its blend of French and English lyrics, soft guitar work, and McCartney's smooth vocals make it a standout love song that showcases the Beatles' ability to blend cultural influences seamlessly. Off topic, but I think Drake's Champagne Poetry samples this track beautifully and does some real nice stuff with it. I also think Girl serves as a similarly amazing song, just from John this time. Those breathy vocal effects that artists usually try so hard to mask are front and center here. It makes for a really atmospheric quality. I'm also a fan of the cheeky backing vocals that come with the bridge and just the poignancy of the reflective lyrics in general. I don't even mind Run For Your Life. I think it's really funny and edgy. I mean, obviously if you take it seriously, it's pretty disturbing. John himself even expressed regret about it, but if you take it as a fun, ditzy bit of hyperbole, then it's fun. Not great by any means, and definitely a strange way to end the record, but not bad either. Fundamentally, I think the diversity showcases the Beatles' ability to absorb and reinterpret a wide range of musical styles, making Rubber Soul a testament to their musical versatility. Its placement above albums like Let It Be on this list is justified by its innovative approach to songwriting, which not only reshaped the future of the Beatles as music, but also had a lasting impact on the broader music landscape. The album's exploration of new musical territory and its role as a precursor to the psychedelic era underscore its pivotal position in the band's history and rock and roll music as a whole. It is, however, still very much a transitional album, which is why it's ranked below Sgt. Pepper's, which is my next pick, another controversial one I suspect.
This is called Good Morning, I believe. I'm not sure about that.
Sgt. Pepper's Lonely Club Hearts Band. Sgt. Pepper's Lonely Hearts Club Band is one of the most iconic and influential albums, not only in the Beatles' discography, but in the history of popular music. This album marks a peak in the Beatles' experimental approach, blending rock and roll with a variety of other genres and utilizing innovative studio techniques. Its placement at this point in the list reflects its groundbreaking nature and lasting impact on the music industry, but also how slightly overrated I think it is. I mean, it did something for sure, but it didn't change the way that we see music today or any of that bollocks. It's not like they're the most experimental band ever. In fact, I wouldn't even label them amongst the most experimental bands of the 60s. The Silver Apples, Mothers of Invention, and even the Velvet Underground were way more experimental in my opinion. It's just weird that they were as kooky as they were considering their popularity. And I'm not bad-mouthing here. I love this album, just not as much as the other 4 albums that I've not mentioned yet. What I appreciate most in this project is probably the conceptual cohesion and innovation. Sgt. Pepper's is often regarded as the first true concept album, with its songs linked by a loose narrative of a fictional band performing a concert. This concept allowed the Beatles to adopt alter egos and experiment more freely with their music and personas, leading to a cohesive yet diverse album that pushed the boundaries of what music could convey. The album features an extraordinary range of musical styles and production styles. George Martin really was a master at his craft. Techniques such as multi-tracking, tape loops, and the extensive use of effects like echo and reverb were revolutionary at the time. Songs like A Day in the Life feature complex arrangements and orchestral crescendos that were unheard of of in popular music until then. I think I value an album's flow and cohesion outside of individual songs more than most people, so the first track on here, as well as the reprise version not really holding their own as individual pieces, doesn't bother me too much. I think they do a really great job setting up and concluding the record, which is ultimately what they're there to do. They're pretty bold arrangements that set up the theme of performance brilliantly. Other highlights include With a Little Help from My Friends, which is another one of the greatest songs of all time in my opinion, on par with In My Life. Ringo kills it vocally, and the melody is catchy, but not annoying. It's very simple, and it's done so well, and it's just so gosh darn lovable, whilst also progressing the themes of the record effectively. Lucy in the Sky with Diamonds is just iconic, and the studio effects like the phasing and the low reorgan are incredibly executed, perfectly capturing the spirit of psychedelic music. Getting Better is an underrated one that, whilst a bit more conventional, has a real sharp and punchy guitar tone that drives the beat really well. I think it's adorable that Paul's lyrics are about how much better things are getting, and how John's are about how things can't get any worse.
A little better all the time. It can't get no worse.
I think it sums up their personalities really well and highlights the contrast that makes the band work cohesively. Even if John's verse does get really dark. Fixing a Hole is fine, but not as dynamic as I'd like. It's a song that if the Beach Boys had covered at the time, I have no doubts that they would have done a much better job. The same can't be said, however, for She's Leaving Home, which I don't think anyone who isn't the Beatles could have done. It's another one of my favourites, just packed with emotional depth and a really tasteful string ensemble, adding a classical touch that greatly enhances the drama and melancholy. But then we get the reason that this album isn't any higher, which is pretty much the entirety of the second half. A Day in the Life is obviously the exception here before you say anything. It speaks for itself. It's ambitious and influential, reflective, with a bump in middle eight to make a multi-part, epic experience like no other, with an orgasmic orchestral crescendo. I also think it was a great choice to have it come after the reprise, as it's a much better closer in my opinion. However, the rest of the second half is just so much weaker than the first. Being for the Benefit of Mr. Kite is a total mess, and the fact it's intentional is almost more insulting. It's chaotic, but in a bad way. And the lyrics are nonsensical, but not for any valid purpose like they are in Lucy in the Sky with Diamonds, for example. It's just John playing fucking word Jenga. Within You Without You, I'm sure is really powerful to some people, but to me reads as I'm 14 and this is deep spoken words over a slow and inaccessible instrumental that just feels so out of place in an album like this. This is worsened by the whiplash that comes afterwards with When I'm 64, which in and of itself is a perfectly cute and lovely song, but structurally doesn't really belong on the same album as Within You Without You. Like, no way. And like I said, I really value how albums work conceptually, of which this one has ups and downs for sure. Lovely Rita is a jaunty and playful rhythm, enriched by inventive sound effects like comb and paper. It's got a quirky and fun texture, I don't have many problems with it. Perfectly good Beatles song. Good Morning, however, is another one of the band's worst outings. I used to have this song as my alarm for the better part of a year, because I'd have to wake up and walk across the room just to turn it off as soon as possible. It's repetitive and grating and annoying with absolutely nothing to offer. The mix is particularly terrible because the harmonies, unlike almost every other Beatles song, are just awful. And the horns are way too overpowering. Don't let this rant at the end here overshadow the great bits of this record though. It's still better than Rubber Soul and Let It Be, so it's still an amazing and rich tapestry of music. A real bold conceptual approach that's musically diverse, but gets a bit lost in the sauce, especially during the second half. Magical Mystery Tour holds a special place in the Beatles' discography. And yes, it's better than Sgt. Pepper's. I'll explain why. Initially released as a double EP in the UK and later as a full album in the US, this project was tied to the accompanying television film of the same name. The album showcases the Beatles' continued exploration of psychedelic music and lush orchestration, featuring some of their most imaginative songs yet. Magical Mystery Tour continues the psychedelic experimentation that Beatles advanced in the Sgt. Pepper's album. Despite its stylistic diversity, the album maintains a sense of cohesion through its thematic exploration of fantasy and escapism. The whimsical and dreamlike atmosphere serves as a unifying thread that connects the varied tracks. Now, where I think this one edges Sgt. Pepper's is mainly track for track. There are more good/great songs on the album than Sgt. Pepper's, and it still has enough concept and cohesion to keep it interesting as a journey. I also think it's more risky than Sgt. Pepper's in a lot of ways, with I Am the Walrus and Strawberry Fields pushing the boundaries more so, using avant-garde production techniques and surreal lyrics. In terms of influence, it also could be argued that it outdoes it. It's very easy to forget how intrinsic All You Need Is Love was to the 1960s ethos, becoming a real anthem for the counterculture movement. But all of that pretentious bullshit aside, It all really comes down to, I think, the songs just being better. So let's talk about them. The title track serves as a real exuberant introduction. It's got a real buoyant melody and a sing-along chorus that's just so much fun to listen to. Fundamentally, the track is just a really good invitation to make a reservation. The Fool on the Hill is criminally underrated by people outside of the Beatles fandom. The cinematic and soothing melody and rich flute and string arrangement juxtapose the zaniness of the opener perfectly, and McCartney's delivery is tender yet slightly haunting. I'm the Walrus is John's masterpiece on the album, celebrated for a deceptively complex arrangement and chord choice/progression. The combination of rock and orchestra create a rich sonic tapestry that's both challenging and rewarding. Strawberry Fields and Penny Lane are such vivid narratives, the former being the better of the two in my opinion, showcasing some real groundbreaking studio techniques, including tape loops and reverse recordings and variable speed tapes. Fucking hell. It's a creative and sonic exploration of memory and identity. Baby You're a Rich Man is another real underrated one, with a well-used clavier line and one of Paul's catchiest bass lines ever. It's one of the best textures of any Beatles song, so I'm really shocked it's not spoken about more. The closer, All You Need Is Love, has one of the worst guitar solos ever, but other than that, its simple yet profound message is communicated effectively over a reggae-inflected beat, building to a lush orchestral crescendo that encapsulates the album's overarching theme of peace and love. Peace and love, peace and love. I am warning you all with peace and love to subscribe to the channel. Tracks like Hello Goodbye and Your Mother Should Know are a lot simpler and more formulaic to a fault, despite the former's popularity. I think that they're slightly out of place and damage the flow of the record, even if they aren't necessarily bad songs. They're just not good either. Same goes for Flying and Blue Jay Way, which are just forgettable and a wee bit tedious. The album represents the Beatles at their most experimentally free, reflecting the peak of their psychedelic phase, and one of their best attempts at the genre, but not as good as some of the tracks on Revolver, which is the next pick. Revolver is often hailed as one of the Beatles' most revolutionary albums, marking a significant transformation in their musical style and studio experimentation. Revolver showcases the band at a pivotal point in their artistic development, blending a variety of musical genres and pushing the boundaries of what popular music could achieve. This is probably the first album in their catalogue that works cohesively rather than just being a bunch of songs, which, considering its stylistic diversity, is actually pretty remarkable. Lyrically, this thing hits really deep as well. Definitely the best lyrics on an album at this point in their career, from For No One to Eleanor Rigby obviously, to even Tomorrow Never Knows, which is pretty existential, and also featured some groundbreaking tape loop effects. Even Yellow Submarine, despite not being the most complex arrangement ever, succeeds in being a kind of childlike and playful experience with the varied sound effects and textured soundscape. Obviously you do have songs like Dr. Robert too, but we'll get to that. The opener, Taxman, is punchy and aggressive and a bit cheeky and bold with the subject matter that sets the tone for the fearless project ahead. I'm also the fan of the live performances and George's solo career with added verses like... I previously mentioned Eleanor Rigby, but I feel it important to really emphasize how poignant and impactful the lyrics and string arrangement are. It's a depth, both topic-wise and music-wise, that so amazingly demonstrates how much and how well the Beatles have evolved and matured as a band and as people. And then when they do go back to the cornier topic of love like the earlier days, they do it via a track like Here, There, and Everywhere, which is one of the finest songs of all time. The melody is gentle and the harmonies are perfect, especially in the updated 2022 version, that does some really great things to it. Love You Too and I'm Only Sleeping are a little more lethargic and ambient. The former, I think, comes across as a bit jarring, but I definitely respect the authenticity and commitment to form. The latter isn't the best on the record by any means, but it is a nice ode to escapism. She Said features some really complex time signatures and powerful psychedelic imagery, which combined with Lennon's intense surrealist lyrics and driving guitar work, create a real compelling narrative of existential confusion. And Your Bird Can Sing, as well as I've Got to Get You Into My Life, are very soulful and vibrant, the latter embracing a Motown influence. These are great tracks, but just a little too breezy and reliant on brass to be top-tier Beatles, if you know what I mean. Dr. Robert is easily the weakest on the album. The vocal delivery seems strangely disinterested and indecisive, and the lyrics are also frivolous. For No One, however, is another one of my absolute favourites, a heartbreakingly beautiful ballad that combines McCartney's poignant lyrics with a minimalist arrangement highlighted by a classical French horn solo. It's a real showcase of emotional and musical subtlety that I can only imagine would kill to listen to after a particular type of breakup. And then Tomorrow Never Knows, of course, is one of the most forward-thinking on the record. I mentioned it earlier, but the droning melodies and Ringo's hypnotic drum pattern display avant-garde at its best. The strengths so obviously outweigh the weaknesses, and it's so enjoyable track for track that I honestly struggle to see how anybody could possibly think that Sgt. Pepper's deserves to be above it in any way, apart from maybe notoriety and influence. But in terms of actual quality and being able to sit down and listen to it, depending on the day, this is the best Beatles album in my opinion. The Beatles' White Album is a monumental release in the Beatles' discography. It's a double album with such a sprawling diversity in musical styles and its experimental approach that it makes all of the others seem plain and homogeneous. By far, the White Album is the most eclectic of all the Beatles albums, featuring a wide range of genres from hard rock to blues, folk, country, and avant-garde. Each member's individual tastes and influences are distinctly showcased, making it a showcase of the band's breadth and depth. But despite this, they all work so well collaboratively. The band play off each other better than any other band that has ever existed. It's what got them so successful to begin with. And whilst the earlier albums almost relied on this tightness, like strictly, later outings like Sgt. Pepper's and Magical Mystery Tour were so experimental that they rejected this aspect of the group, which is why they're lower on the list than this one and Abbey Road, which is obviously number one. I think in terms of all the experimental psychedelic albums, Revolver did it best, but this one and Abbey Road strike the perfect balance between tight 60s rock band that can play together endlessly without mistakes because of their incredible chemistry, and also experimental, psychedelic, weird, different abstract recording techniques. It's basically the best of everything that we've covered so far, all blended into one. This album also marks a peak in personal expression for the band members, with songs directly reflecting their individual experiences and states of mind during this period. Songs like Julia reflect Lennon at his most introspective. Its acoustic simplicity and emotional vulnerability make it an easy favourite for any listener. McCartney has his own acoustic solo, however, with Blackbird, everybody's first finger-picking lesson, and thank God it's a good one like this. Simple yet profound, a timeless piece of social commentary sung with McCartney's incredible vocals, more tender in this one. Despite, or perhaps because of, the minimalist approach compared to the lush orchestrations of Sgt. Pepper's, the White Album experiments with the studio as an instrument in itself. This can be heard in the avant-garde sound collage of Revolution 9, which I'm not going to call a good song, I'm not that pretentious. It's difficult to listen to and completely inaccessible, although certainly bold and contributes to the discussion surrounding this album. I wouldn't have personally had it on here if I was the Beatles, but to be fair, of all the Beatles records, it probably does fit the most on this one. I think the studio is used far better and more practically with the multi-part structure of Happiness is a Warm Gun, which again, might be my favourite Beatles song. It's complex with shifting time signatures and lauded for its ambitious composition and Lennon's intense, yet engaging storytelling. It's just an incredible track, a bit like the 60s' answer to Beach Life and Death. Another one of the greatest songs of all time, by the way. The very diversity that makes the White Album fascinating, however, also leads to its primary criticism, as well as the reason why Abbey Road is better, which is a lack of cohesion. With each Beatle increasingly working on individual projects within the group setting, the album at times feels more like a collection of solo works rather than a unified band effort. This fragmentation can be pretty jarring at points. Looking on it as a classic album, it's silly to say you change certain things about it or get rid of tracks, but if it were to come out today, I would probably critique it for being excessive and self-indulgent. The album can feel bloated and unwieldy, especially with weird filler tracks like Wild Honey Pie. On that note, while the album features some of the band's best work, it also includes some of their worst. Songs like Why Don't We Do It in the Road and Don't Pass Me By just don't hold up over the more strong compositions. But we're being way too negative with this number 2, god damn it! So you know what? We're gonna speed through each and every song and find out how many are skips, so I can justify my position. I love Back in the USSR. It's a raucous and energetic parody of Beach Boys style surf rock with spirited vocals and a driving rhythm, though obviously not done as well as a band like, I don't know, the Beach Boys would have done it. Dear Prudence is a gorgeous and intricate work of finger-picking with soothing vocals by Lennon and great lyrical depth. Glass Onion is straightforward, but I, as well as I imagine other fans, appreciate the meta-narrative and callbacks. Obladi Oblada I actually really like and quote regularly, and I love reggae. Wild Honey Pie is weird, but brief enough for me to never really really skip it, and I appreciate how it adds to the record's unrestrained nature. Bungalow Bill is nothing special, but I do actually really like Yoko's vocals. It's a very nice touch. It's heavy-handed, but still vivid and catchy with a unique blend of folk and pop. While My Guitar Gently Weeps is a powerful ballad that cleverly utilizes Clapton as lead guitarist in what turned out to be a genius move. Its profound lyrics about love and disillusionment are beautifully supported by one of the Beatles' most memorable musical arrangements. Live performances really do seem as though George and Clapton are conversing via their guitars. Martha My Dear is just charming and whimsical. I'm So Tired gets across the feeling of fatigue really well. It's raw and emotional, strong yet somber. Good track, but the Smiths would have done a far better job with it. Piggies is on the nose, but saved by the harpsichord and string arrangements. It's also just pretty lovable in its over-the-top satire and oinking backup vocals. Rocky Raccoon is very playful and features a really fun vocal performance by Paul. Don't Pass Me By is probably the first skip on the album because it's just simple to a fault. Why Don't We Do It in the Road is another skip. I Will is a perfectly fine love song, but the band just has so many better songs about love that I'd never come back to it. Birthday is also probably a skip because of just how trivial and lacking in depth it is. Your Blues is one of my favorites though, and is what I was talking about primarily when I mentioned how the band went back to utilizing their tight rock roots, ditching all the avant-garde stuff and just playing together as an amazing rock and roll band like the older days. But now with songwriting that's evolved so much. This is an incredibly gritty and powerful blues performance and I adore it. Mother Nature's Son is very underrated and tranquil. I love how soothing the melody is, though admittedly a lot of these solo Paul acoustic tracks sometimes blend into one. They're a bit too similar sometimes for me. Everybody's Got Something to Hide except for Me and My Monkey, while straightforward and repetitive, is energetic and spontaneous enough for me to still enjoy. Sexy Sadie stands out for sure as a smooth, sultry melody with some bitey lyrics from John and a compelling piano-driven arrangement. I probably don't love Helter Skelter as much as everyone else does, but it's still an amazing and memorable track with a real intriguing structure to it, even if it was ruined by that awful remaster. Long 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 is stupidly good. Soft and haunting, building to a spiritually reflective crescendo. The subtle organ and delicate drumming complement Harrison's gentle vocals beautifully. Revolution 1 has a nice laid-back shuffling and smooth delivery, though I definitely prefer the single version. I wouldn't skip this one. Honey Pie is a brilliant homage to 1920s jazz. It's also just adorable and I probably enjoy it more than I should. Savoy Truffle is real funky with a groove that stands out on this album. Nothing too special though. Cry Baby Cry is once again nothing special, but it's eerie and vivid enough to be enjoyed, especially with the unused track at the end that in many ways saves it. Revolution 9 is actually avant-garde and special enough for me to never skip it when I listen to this record. Good Night is a suitable closer. George Martin smashed it with a lush orchestration, and I think Ringo was a good choice of singer for this tune as well. I wish I could find it, but a couple of years ago I found a really rare tape recording, like within the depths of Daily Motion or one of them websites, of John singing this song. It was really good, but I think Yoko must have taken them all down, and that isn't me being a crybaby. That genuinely, I think that's what's happened for whatever reason. Probably more her team, but yeah. So overall, that's what, like, 4 skips? That's only like 13% of the record, which, considering the fact that there's 30 songs, I don't think is bad at all, especially considering that that's still a smaller percentage than every other album up until this point. The only Beatles album with a better percentage of non-skips, in my opinion, is Abbey Road, which is why it's number 1.
Come together.
It's basically the White Album if you kept only the best songs and added a really satisfying sense of cohesion to it. Can't really get any better than that. I mean, even the production is about 1 billion times better. Oh, I've got it right here. Just to be clear, that's not a slight on the White Album, because you can make a very good case for this being the most well-produced album of all time. It's an album that's been discussed and debated about for over half a century. It's had such a profound cultural impact, and every song has been spoken about so much that it honestly feels pointless for me to talk about it. So I won't. Bye.